Elana, good afternoon.
And good afternoon, Stefano.
Thank you very much for accepting to join this new web series called War as Reset. I'm in Berlin, you are in Jerusalem. Perhaps the heat is the same because these days in Berlin is very, very hot. I'm very happy to have you here for many reasons, because you are in Jerusalem, because you are Israeli, and because you are an activist working on the Israeli-Palestinian cause or war field. As I said many, many times, I felt an urge to talk about war and even about war as reset because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. And because we moved when, many wished the pandemic was nothing more than a dream, a nightmare. And the truth is that even still now, COVID is a reality in many parts of the world. And many wish the Russo-Ukrainian war was nothing more than a nightmare. And as we know, psychoanalysts know very well that nightmares can only disappear when their meaning is represented. And this is what I'm trying to do humbly with this series. And also because following Andrew Samuels, I truly believe that this conversation in depth can be an antithesis to what I call media bulimia or media voyeurism. So these media outlets, TV, even radio, the less, newspaper, they share news that are really, really empty and not help to understand the situation. I want to start with a question looking at war, because war, it's really the antithesis of the Vanity Fair. War is the atrocity fair, but when it gets to TV, media outlet, it becomes again the Vanity Fair, where we are attracted by war, we eat war on a daily basis, but then nothing changes, Yesterday I was talking to Luigi Zoya and we looked at the paranoia between the COVID times and the repercussion of the news of COVID, and now this one, what is going to be next? You live in a country that is at war. You live in a country that is under threat on a daily basis. And what could be the same from the Palestinian side. What is war, Elana?
It's a big question. What is war? But I think that basically war is in the basis of human nature. And it's sad to think about that it's an archetype. And this is something that people have been doing, and people have been doing since primordial times. And maybe in the past few decades, we grew up thinking that war is ended and war is conducted by various means, but not in the way that it was conducted before. And I, at least for the past 20 years, I think I learned to look at war and to look at acts of war from the perspective of who profits from that and how acts of war influence the mind of people and how we are taught to think about it. But this invasion of Russia to Ukraine struck me totally shocked, because it's so violent and it's so aggressive and it's so savage. I think me, as many other people, we hoped that this kind of sites are not here anymore, but it's an illusion because they're here. These kind of sites are here in Africa. These kinds of sites were in Chechnya. These kind of sites are all over. It's just that the Western world doesn't look at it. And you say that I live in a country that is in war. So there is a question about what kind of war we are in. And we are used to think about Israel being under threat, under existential threat. But it's not that right, and it's not that true. Israel is not under existential threat since long time. And that's the notion that we were taught, that we are under threat. And we have to be strong, so we will not be extinct. I want to question that, because that notion is dangerous in my eyes. And there are attacks on Israeli civilians, and there are missiles attacks. In Jerusalem, as I live here for the past 30 years, I've been witnessing attacks on Israeli civilians. And as every Jerusalemite, when I hear more than one siren, I jump. Because we're programmed for that. But
you run to the shelter.
No, I jump. No, we don't run to the shelter because of sirens. But when I hear more than one siren, I already immediately think that something happened. It's not just a heart attack for somebody, because there was a time that it was like that. And living in the middle of, in the center of Western Jerusalem, when you hear more than one siren, during the mid-90s and the beginning of the 2000s, that usually meant that there was some kind of a bombing. But nowadays, the violence that we perpetuate over the Palestinians is much greater than the violence that we suffered here in Israeli areas. And that is a thing that I try to do something about and that I worry about, because the way that things are presented in the media is that we as Israelis, we are protecting ourselves against great violence. And it's not just like that, okay? It's a very mutual thing, and we are the powerful side here. And as a powerful side, for me, it's how I see things, we have the responsibility to think about it and to stop it. And that's not what is going on. So war for me is, yeah, do you want to say something?
Go on. War. No. War for me is?
War for me is a very big suffering caused to human beings. That's one thing. And war is also something that is used to constellate public opinion. And it's something that is used to make us think things. And I want to look at it.
You also said the war is about who benefits the most. But if we look at the conflict between Israeli and Palestinian, it's a never-ending not benefiting the most. Of course, Israel is expanding, occupying more territories, and the Palestinians are defending themselves. But it's like this basically since the 40s.
Before.
So almost 100. It's a never, of course, before, but you know, with the creation of the State of Israel is a never-ending story. Let me ask you, I really want to ask you my usual question about the war in Ukraine, but you know the answer then would be about Israel and Palestine. Usually after asking what is war, and I really like what you said, war is about who benefits the most. Is war masculine? Your army, the Israeli army, is made of male and female, men and women. When I came to Jerusalem, I think was spring 2006, I remember these kids with big rifles. And I remember them coming to Yad Vashem the first day, the first week, perhaps first month of their training, in normal clothes with these big guns, entering this museum, somehow being told, this is our story, we have an enemy, as you said, we have to defend. And for me, it was really shocking.
Why?
To see these young people with a gun, because me as an Italian, those years, the army was becoming professionalized, not the defense. Yeah, was a bit dystopic, but I think the theme of dystopia will come up today. Is war male? Is war female? Is war masculine, feminine? If we follow Freud, we can look at aggressivity as one of our traits or our instinct or tribe. Is it more masculine? Is it more feminine? What do you think? Is war masculine? Is it not?
I was thinking about this question since we began corresponding, and when we think about war as masculine or feminine, it doesn't have to do only with the men and women, yeah, because the females, the women in the Israeli army are women, but they can engage masculine activities. And maybe we can think about masculine forms of war, which are the majority, yeah, like what we see in Russia and Ukraine and what we see throughout history, aggressive, violent attacks. But you know, there is an interesting myth about Krishna, an Indian myth, Hindu myth about Krishna
Yeah.
that the Stefano, you disappeared.
No, I'm here. I'm just improving the Wi-Fi. I'm back.
So the myth tells about a terrible demon that was killing many people back in that times. And people asked for the help of the gods. And this demon, he had a promise from the gods that no man can kill him. So only a woman can kill him. So Krishna asked Parvati, his wife, to interfere and to do something about that. And she went into like a mania of killing, and she couldn't stop. So would we say that killing is masculine? Yeah. I don't know. How to define.
We can go to Medea or Athena. You're right, and actually, this is what is coming up, and this is why I ask this question. Of course, many say that the usual 20th century, 19 and before warfare is masculine because male compared to female have a certain body, certain aggressivity, and I always remind that nature is interesting. Of course, talking about Ukraine, when the special corps or the special police in Maidan attack the demonstrators in the Maidan Square in early 2014, somehow instinctively, the women were surrounded by men, protected by men. Because I always say, of course, then we, for example, Kurds women defending their country or defending their land against ISIS, IS, the Islamic State, or many other examples of even the FARC, the Colombian fighters, that there are also women, and not only Colombian women. But the point is that if only women go at war, the nation dies. Because there will be no women to procreate, to bring children. This is a very important thing that is not symbolical. My next question is...
Before that, I want to tell you something about masculinity and femininity, okay? Because this idea of women conducting things differently, we find it in Lysistrata, and we find it in the Liberian resistance, and women have a different way to do things. But thinking about women as protected from violence, I'm always participating in demonstrations against the occupation. But in 2002 or 2003 or something like that, I was in a demonstration against the separation wall in Jerusalem. And there was a thought that Israeli women will not be beaten up by the police. There was a thought back then. And they asked us to go ahead to the first rows of the demonstration. And that was a frightening demonstration with tear gas and the clubs of the police. And that idea that Israeli women, like white women, are protected from violence was not true. It wasn't true back then, and it's not true now. Of course, we are less prone to being beaten than the Palestinians, of course, and we're less prone to being beaten than the men in the demonstrations, but still.
But you see, this brings me to a question that is much further on page 2 or 3, but I think it's appropriate now. Why war or a war state turns normal people into beasts. An example is this one, where there is an escalation. Women usually are not beaten by the police. Coffins are not beaten by a police. But what happened last week is really unbearable and unbelievable, that a dead body, is beaten, and those that hold the body are beaten too. This is really bringing out the beast in us.
Yeah. But that doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a gradual act of seeing people as non-human beings. In order to do that, if you want to beat a woman or a coffin, you need to see this woman or the coffin carriers as non-human. You need to separate humanity and attribute humanity to one group, and the others are non-human. And that practice of acting like that in demonstrations have been there since years and years. In the demonstrations with the Palestinians. Palestinians are beaten and shot in demonstrations since ever. Gradually, in the past few years, it also entered the demonstration inside Israel. So people who were demonstrating against Netanyahu in the past few years also were beaten, not in the same way, but also. And more than that, also the Haredi people, the ultra-Orthodox people who were demonstrating, they were also beaten by the police. So the police becomes more and more violent because of the dehumanization of what is called the enemy. And then you get to beating up coffin carriers. I think that's how I see it. In order to get out the savage out of the person, you need to make this person see the other as non-human. And there are various mechanisms of that. We see it in Ukraine. We see it also in the way that the Ukrainians perceive the Russians. It's interesting. I just now heard that the Ukrainians, they call the Russian soldiers orcs. Did you hear that?
No, but it will guess. Well, what I know is that our Ukrainian colleagues, and I tried because I'm trying to talk to Ukrainians, to Russian. It's very difficult to talk to Russian, and it's very difficult to talk to Israelis because you might personally affected by these, and it's no bullshit. Legally affected. So there was a colleague that was there to talk to me, but the Ukrainian colleagues have no wish to engage in a conversation, discussion with the Russian. They say maybe in a few years, maybe soon, but now allow us to fight this war, to defend. I have a patient who fled a month ago, 2 months ago actually, and she said, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, to kill was illegal. You would go to jail. Now we have to kill to defend ourselves. I mean, I want to converse with you about this because in our white Judeo-Christian law, it's unthinkable. But now in Ukraine is the daily thing. What about you? Because the threat you were talking about is the same. Of course, not the civilians, but every civilian in Israel is also a soldier.
Not every, but many. And
but we will
that's the
not every, because it's also important, the not every. Because if you say I don't, you are a traitor.
Mm-hmm.
You are considered a traitor.
Yeah, that's true in the Israeli public opinion. But the discourse of refusing and the discourse of saying I'm not going to the army is a small one, but it exists now. In the past few, I think maybe 20 years, it's something that you can think about. When I was a teenager growing up, it wasn't even a possibility. I didn't think about it at all.
No.
The possibility of saying I'm not going to the army. And I did as everybody else. But I knew very little back then when I went to the army. I didn't, growing up in Israel, and I didn't know anything about the disaster of the Palestinians. I didn't hear the word Nakba. I didn't know what are the remains of the villages around. I grew up in Beersheba. It's a southern city that was a Palestinian city up until 1948. And there are Palestinians' homes there, demolished one and also inhabited ones. I never asked the question. I didn't know. I didn't know that these houses were inhabited by other people. I didn't know that these people are refugees. I didn't know where they are. And that's the way we all grew up. Looking for this information, it's an act of wishing to know. And there is a friend of mine, an older...
When you said, I never asked myself the question. When did you ask the question? When did you realize that there is the possibility to look at things from a different point of view? So when did you become an activist, I would say?
I began at high school because I was in a youth movement of one of the political parties, the leftist ones. It doesn't exist anymore. And then I began asking questions, but mostly when I was a student, a freshman student in the university, I went working for one of the human rights organizations called the Center for Defense of the Individual. It's an Israeli-based organization that was receiving complaints of Palestinians of things that the government, the police, the army did to them. And my job back then, was to follow these complaints and to help these people try to get justice, which they never got. But when the army forces would arrest somebody in the middle of the night and take him somewhere, they would never tell the parents where do they take the arrested person. And so the parents would call the office in the morning, and I was the one who looked for the person where he is. And then we sent a lawyer to this person to help him. Or when back then there was still a practice of torture, which was in a way legal. It was before the Supreme Court banned torture. So we would take the documentation of torture and submit them to the Supreme Court. So I began understanding things that I didn't see and I wasn't exposed to. And I was shocked. And I was trying to tell people about what I learned. And people thought that I'm lying. It's impossible. It can't be. We don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
You're imagining things. Because people cannot stand the idea of us being perpetrators. And there is only victims. Yeah. And there is a a phrase that I heard from a friend of mine, an elderly woman who survived Auschwitz. And she says that the Israeli people, it's not that we don't want to know. We actively want not to know.
But you see, with all due respect, because the history of Israel, the people of Israel is long and so important, but I always come to my mind David and Goliath. And often I think that not Israel per se, the state, not the nation, but the state, the government became Goliath, is not David anymore. And it's very difficult to understand this because thousands and thousands of years of being under threat and because of the Holocaust. And I find it interesting that right now Ukraine is actually the area, or South Ukraine, Galicia, where the biggest population among, Poland, Galicia, Czech Republic, and Austria, were the biggest, the most interesting, intellectual, well-developed, variegated Jewish population was in Europe. From the doctor to the shoemaker. If you would move the Jewish, as then happened, from one town, would become empty. My next question is, of course, for both wars or for both conflicts.
But can I answer your comment? Because I have an interesting things that are happening with that lately. I was born in Kiev. And, yeah. But I was 3 years old when we came here. And I don't remember anything. And my father, who was a 4 years old boy when the Nazi people entered Kiev, only now he begins talking about it. He's 85 years old now, and he never said anything. Only now he's beginning to talk about that. And I know the family history, and I know that his grandfather was murdered by Ukrainians. And now, around this conflict, around the Russian invasion to to Ukraine, in our institute, there are a lot of connections with the Ukrainians and with the Russians, and I began supporting some Ukrainian analysts, and I participate in a project of training people to work with sexual violence, because that's what I do here in Israel. And it's horrible. It's really horrible to think about that. And usually I don't perceive myself as of Ukrainian origins. And I'm not connected to this notion of the victim that is a cultural complex here. But I was listening to stories that Ukrainian people were telling me. And I was thinking about that, my father's grandfather, who was killed by Ukrainians. So in a way, it connected in my mind, in a very strange way, which is totally alien to what I usually think.
You mean killed by the Ukrainians that joined the Nazis?
No, before, in 1903. Much before. In one of these villages.
Anti-Semitism, I mean, many people think that the Nazi were the only anti-Semite, but actually, if you really look, anti-Semitism has been there century and thousands of years. And at the end of the 19th century, became stronger and stronger in the middle of Europa. But for me, then it's very important to ask you, Putin's narrative is that the Ukrainians are Nazi. And it's a fake news, it's a lie. I mean, there is, of course, this battalion Azov that are Nazi. Oh, unfortunately, everywhere, or neo-Nazi, everywhere in Europe right now, there are neo-Nazi movement that, thanks God, are under control. I remember when I was a kid, somebody from my area with whom I grew up and played football, he became a neo-Nazi. He was arrested and stayed under house arrest for many years. And hopefully he changed his mind. So I believe that those that join neo-Nazi or super left movements are really people that need help, psychological help, because nowadays are really coming from either a difficult story, fragile families, and they put in that a vision that is 100 years old. But there is also perhaps a psychosocial, we need to have a psychosocial effort that for you as a Jewish and born in Kiev, I take this opportunity to ask you, could it be that the Ukrainians that suffer so much Russians, communism, Stalin, embrace the Germans, embrace the Nazi when they come as helper and has a tool to push away the communism? Because actually, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the Austro-Hungarian empires, the Ukrainians, the Polish were actually better treated than under the Russians. So this is a narrative good for Putin to say they are all Nazis, which is not true. The president is Jewish. But I wonder whether also the Ukrainians that got closer to right-wing and the Nazism did it consciously or unconsciously as to push away the enemy, which in that case was Stalin, the famine of the 1930s. It's a very psychosocial, political, complicated discussion that is worth to be done, because otherwise we will be so superficial.
I don't know about this movement in Ukraine in the 30s, but Ukraine, as every other part of the Soviet Union, was under severe poverty and starvation and under suspicion. Yeah, the Stalinistic policy of tell the government who of your neighbors is withholding money and withholding food that was rewarded. It was a terrible thing. So I don't know what drove Ukrainians, if it drove Ukrainians to the Germans. I don't know. I know about terrible suffering that Ukrainians and Jewish Ukrainians and everybody was suffering back then. But today, nowadays, saying that somebody is a Nazi is kind of marking him like the ultimate evil. And if somebody is the ultimate evil, you can do anything to him. That's a justification. So that's dangerous in the same way as to call people not human. Then you can do whatever you like.
But as when the Nazis were saying the Jewish were the ultimate evil,
Yeah.
and the cause of the bad situation. That is interesting because I'm really, the more I talk with colleagues and I run this conversation, I'm asking what is the ultimate meaning of this war, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, but also of the Israelo-Palestinian conflict. And more there is a fantasy. Reparation or reset for the early 20th century psychosocial political mess. I truly love Joseph Roth. Austrian would say, but he was not Austrian because he was born in Lemberg in Lviv, so in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it was Galicia. A Jewish author that is very dear to me, so Middle European, and he was saying that the more and more the Austrian army was not at war, not the Hungarian, but the Austrian army was not at war. So from mid-19th century, they were waiting for war. They were training. But while training, they were also gambling, prostitutes or prostitution, corruption, losing honor. So really, of course, Austria Felix is in our mind, what Franz Josef did, culture. But then more and more the society became like the Romans at the end of the empire, corrupt, otium. So the core values were lost. And somehow, actually, Joachim Fest, who is a very, very interesting German historian and journalist, said that both Nazism and communism came at the beginning of the 20th century to repair the bourgeois industrialization and the loss of values. Putin is doing the same. He's coming to correct Ukraine from the European values. I want to read something from a paper that is very dear to Jungians, Wotan. Jung writes, when we look back to the time before 1914, we find ourselves living in a world of events which would have been inconceivable before the war. We were even beginning to regard war between civilized nations as a fable, thinking that such an absurdity would become less and less possible in our rational, internationally organized world. Isn't this what at least we Europeans thought until 2 months ago? And then Jung continues, but in the sphere of the religion, we can see that once that some very significant things have been happening, we need feel no surprise that in Russia, and he wrote this in 1936, in Russia, the colorful splendor of Eastern Orthodox Church have been superseded by the movement of the godless. So the Red Revolution, Lenin. Isn't Putin trying to do, although I don't believe it because it's only a narrative, he's doing it for power, as we said, and who benefits? Isn't Putin using religion and spirituality as to bring back the old values? But actually, these values are 1,000 years back. He looks at Vladimir as the Nazis were looking at the Middle Age. So it's always going back to find something that is good, but it's very difficult to look at the future. Is this the same problem in Israel and Palestine? To not be able to look at the future where there is coexistent mutuality.
That's the big disappointment of the peace movement, because many people in the peace movements thought that people are rational. People want to live in peace. People want to flourish. People want to earn money. So if people understand that the war and occupation is bad for economy and for life, then people will do the thing that is rational. And then we can go somewhere. But it's not that. It's not the thing that is happening. The forces of it's not only religion, it's also nationality, nationalism are very, very strong. And sometimes they overcome, mostly they overcome the forces of rationality. But you are quoting Jung, and it's like it gives me the shivers as it is in the past few months, because we have it in the West. Yeah, it's in the West, but we weren't feeling the same when it's in Africa, when Sudan is being attacked, when Eritrea is fighting, when things like that happened in Chechnya, and the horrible rapes that the that the Russian army is doing have been taking place in Chechnya before. We weren't so shocked. Yeah, and I've been in a conference in Sicily.
Why?
Why? Because
why?
we look away.
Because sorry, I didn't hear it.
We look away. It's not.
Or yes, and I will come to this, but I also have another propose, because we are, as Tom Wolfe would say, when he was looking at the very engaged left-wing people in New York that then were spending weekends at the Hamptons drinking champagne, so not in the shithole, we are radical chic, or even more. Our activism is gauche caviar, as the French would say. So it's, we go to wash with the caviar, and many wish that this war will end soon, not because we want peace, but because we want to go on watching Netflix.
Yeah. And Zelensky doesn't allow us to do that. That's the greatness of Zelensky. Zelensky, he pushes the reality in the West.
Communicator, he's really a good communicator. Every day, every country where he speaks, he says the right word connected to the people and the psyche. But I also have another idea why it's not only we look away, is because we white Europeans, Judeo-Christian white Europeans, have a moral superiority toward everyone else.
True.
So when there was the war in Yugoslavia, we had a moral superiority. They are not like us. They are inferior.
Yeah.
They are blacks.
Yeah.
I use blacks, obviously, because it's important to underline also etymologically the problematic of these. They are inferior. And we Jungians, when we look at the concept of the primitive, is again problematic. We cannot use it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Rightly so. But I think that Ukraine told us since the early 2006 and 2008, and especially 2014, we don't want to be under a state that directly or indirectly is an authority. We want to have the right to self-determine ourselves. So we want to belong to certain values. There are the values that Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida underline when looking at what brings Europe together. And we will read them in a second. But we didn't see them as white Judeo-Christian as us, as Western European. We saw the Russianness or the Slavicness too much in them. So you don't belong to our club. And this is what they're saying. It's not about BMW, McDonald's, or all this stuff, or shashuka that is so good. But it's actually, we want Derrida and Habermas, after 2003, after the invasion of Iraq, they ask, what binds Europeans together? And the answer is a political mentality different from the American one, and based on some common traits, an aversion of the use of force, first of all, and therefore an insistence on law and respect for international legality. Support for a global system based on liberal, multilateral institutions and human rights. Fruit of the past inspired by opposite principles and characterized by centuries of bloody carnage. Precisely, this mentality had to push Europe to build a foreign and security policy anchored to the EU, overcoming the stupid and simplistic opposition between war and peace. What do you think?
That white people wrote this because there is a kind of a blindness in this idea, because Europe, as well as America and as well as Israel, has other ways to kill, not violently with knives and with rapes, but by economy and by other means. And this war in the middle of Russia reminds us that we cannot dissociate. It reminds us what we don't want to see and we don't want to hear. And it's like shoves in our face the savage of men, which the Europeans, I think, and the Israelis as well, don't want to see. The other is the savage, the black ones. Yeah, they are the savages. We are not. We are refined people, but we're not, because killing by bombs from the plane, the airplane, from afar, killing people is not different than killing by hands.
Is killing. I have here two questions because I want to hear about your activism. Yeah, I think it's important that we also get really first-hand views on activism. But before, I want to ask you a question that is very provocative, but is in line with what you just said. What is the difference between this war or this invasion, so the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the crap perpetrated by the US since Second World War, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc.? What about the US invasion and occupation or political destabilization since 1994 of many countries under the guise of liberating them, and since 1991 under the pretext of spreading liberal democracy? If you listen to the speech that George Bush Sr. gave to the State of the Union on 11th September 89, he's talking about a new course, actually says a new order made of peace, where, you know, the big ones will not prevail. And then there was Iraq, and then there was Afghanistan. So this dystopic view, or this really psychotic view, is very important, also if we listen to what you said. Maurizio Ferrara, who is an Italian journalist, wrote on Corriere della Sera, the most popular newspaper in Italy, on March 7, that the US invasion of Iraq, many commentators underlined that was a predetermined carnage, just like the one of the past 90 days in Ukraine, which took place after a month of preparation. Ferrara reminds us that the Nobel Prize for Literature, Svetlana Alexievich, has drawn a very clear picture of the imperiality impulses, not only of Putin, but also of a large part of the Russian population, the long wake of the Homo Sovieticus, and before that of the Tsarist tradition. What about the imperialist impulses of the USA? Apart from the United States, every time the British invaded and occupied a country, they created problems. Your region, for example, Kenya, Cyprus, and one could say they still occupy Ireland. Are the action of the British Crown, the death they cause, any different than those of Stalin, those of the US, those of Putin right now, or since the past decade? When colonial Britain occupied countries and took everything from them, the capitalist US invaded countries for geopolitical reasons. I think it's very important to wash off this rightness of the whiteness, of this moral superiority that you brought in this. I didn't think, and you're right. And this is my 15th conversation, that Derrida and Habermas, yes, left-wing, but very white.
First of all, I'll tell you, yeah, of course, I think it's not totally the same, yeah, because Stalinistic practices and also Soviet practices later, after Stalin, are not the same like the American practices. The kind of distrust and the kind of paranoia that they installed in the people in the Soviet Union is different than the way that the West does that. But we don't want to know about it. We in this separating thinking of the West as good and the Soviets or the Muslims or the any other which is opposing the West are bad, we don't see the evil that we are causing. And if you ask me about my activism, that's my purpose. My purpose also as an analyst, I want to bring into consciousness the things that the consciousness doesn't want to see. And in a way, I think it's also the purpose of analysis, to let the ego encounter the things that are shadowy and that the ego resists. But it's difficult. And in analysis, we need to do that in a very, very careful way, because if we confront somebody with his shadow, it can overwhelm the person and also create resistance. So I'm looking for the ways to bring into consciousness of this superior white Westerns, the things that are hidden.
How do you do so? Because you are white Western, one can say. How do you? I know what you do, but I would like, if you want, to say what you say. You already said something about your past. What about right now? Because I know you are very active.
Not so active. Not so active in the past few years because I got tired. And talking to people about what they don't want to hear is really difficult. So because of my involvement in the field and because of the people that I meet, I try to tell people around me within the Israeli circles about the life of people in the Palestinian people, about what they live through everyday life, about how it is when soldiers enter your house in the middle of the night and take your 13 years old son to interrogation and talk to you in the language that you don't know, and you're dead terrified and you don't know where your son is. So I'm trying to tell about what's going on. Or I have a very good friend in Gaza who I talk with on a regular basis. And when he tells me what happens when the bombings come, I try to tell it to my friends around. And it's difficult to hear because it's human. And most of what I do is I try to be a witness. I try to be a witness to what's going on, and I try to participate in peaceful demonstrations and to see. And then when the media says that the demonstration was violent, I can say, and I know what happened there because I was there. It wasn't violent most of the time.
Before I proposed that David became Goliath, and we know that David overcame Goliath through an act of violence, not talking. If we say that the Palestinians now are the new David, and I know it could sound to many like blasphemy, we know that the situation will not change through more violence. Yeah, so one can ask, why the bombings? Why the terrorist attack? Why the rockets? Well, I would say desperation. Yeah, but I'm a white European, so I really know nothing about it. That's why I would like to talk to Palestinians who live in Palestine and to hear their point of view. But I was wondering whether what you did in your life, what we are doing right now, and the concept of war as reset of what? I think that culture, I started thinking that culture is the reset that follows war. Only culture can help understand. And what you did, what you're doing, this need to link the conscious and the unconscious, the known, the unknown, what we know and what we don't want to know, is exactly this. We come to war, and war is the only possibility when culture is not possible. Somebody calls it soft power, where there's really an attitude to try to sit down, but sometime in a certain region is simply impossible.
Mm-hmm. The culture. What do you mean by culture in that way?
Everything that brings people together.
Mm-hmm. So may I?
Well,
okay. May I propose another aspect of that?
Please.
Not only culture, but symbolization. You began with the idea of war is something that happens when we can't symbolize. Okay, so symbolization is very, very important. And the way to represent the emotions and the way to represent history, then that can be a way out. But it's very, very difficult around here because representation is only allowed to the Israeli side. Okay, and the Palestinians, I think, they are fighting for a representation of their narrative and for the survival of their human spirit, as well as Ukrainians. They are fighting for the survival of human spirit.
Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. I thank you very, very much.
Okay. Thank you, Stefano. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Bye-bye.